Hour. As you might have guessed from the music, this might be a bit of a Christmas special. And I have to apologize for the music. You'll see why it's not up to my normal standard. And this fits into the topic quite well, actually. So if it gets too annoying hearing the few public domain versions of the first Noel, I may turn it off later, but for now, let's have that in the background. Don't worry, I put in several versions so you could get a broad spectrum of what passes for legal plagiarization in these days, I would call it. Okay, yeah, so we're going to call this talk The Real First Noel, an all-father side chat for Christmas. Let's talk about this word Noel. You'll notice if you look at my title that I put a hyphen in it to make it more obvious that I'm talking about Noel. No being not, the non-existence of El, which is one of the words that has been used to describe a god. I am going to, in the course of this talk, punch some holes in almost every bit of mythology that every religion, cult, has ever posited about this holiday we celebrate next month. Noel. Now this is, if you look for the etymology of this word, it's kind of specious because it's well known that Noel is French. Joyeux Noël is how French greet others to a Merry Christmas. And the etymologists will tell you, oh, well, it's somehow tied back to Latin word for birth, and don't really give any reasonable argument for how that happened. Now, the fact that there's an L in it leads others to say, well, it must have some Hebrew origins, because it seems to tie in with something biblical. But that line of reasoning doesn't really get very far. It's not even popular among Hebrew scholars or the scholars who are working at patching up the differences between Judaism and Christianity, and maybe even Islam, although I don't think they really want to bring them into their big tent just yet. Okay, well, I'm going to tell you that this word Noel is a very important one. And the fact that it exists in a very famous Christmas carol that we all are aware of, the first Noel, is very important. A very spiritually important thing. Why is the song the first Noel, not the first Christmas? Make more sense to children if you sang it that way, wouldn't it? Okay, well, in fact, this is one of the many words I'm going to point out to you that is very strong evidence for one of the common themes that I'm going to be talking about. The fact that we live in a simulation. One of many simulations called the multiverse, where independent souls get to explore themselves and others in a more or less safe environment. Okay, now, the beginning of all this simulation was an idea. The beginning of everything is an idea. This is the truth of creation. You know it. Everything you see created around you was the culmination of an idea. An idea to have a child, an idea for a new product, an idea for a new holiday, an idea for a new way to envision an old holiday. And this ties into the subject quite well, too. Now, some of you who are of the atheist cult, and it is a cult, it is a religion, don't deny it, will argue, well, Christianity's a bunch of bollocks because Christianity obviously is all about Christmas, and Christmas and Easter are both pagan holidays. And you're right. And to the extent that you don't just dismiss them that way, because Christians are so dismissive of pre-Christian traditions. You don't get to play the same game, folks, unless you're making a new religion that's just as bad as the old one. And that's most of what human-created religion, or I would say philosophy, is. It's creating new bullshit based upon bad assumptions. Because if anybody had ever had the right assumptions, you wouldn't come up with paradoxes. You wouldn't come up with theories that don't meet. And you wouldn't have these endless conversations between philosophers, which I'll put in a plug for my Monty Python friends there. The Philosopher song is wonderful. Immanuel Kant was an opus santus very rarely. I don't know the rest of it, but it's a wonderful song, a very inspired song. Poking fun at philosophical religions, and they are religions. Anytime you come up with a theory to explain what you don't understand, until that theory is supported by a massive amount of evidence, it's a religion, or has the capability to be a religion. Newtonian science, Newtonian mechanics was a religion, until Einstein demolished that religion. And now we have people who have new science religions based upon new versions of misunderstandings of basic premises. And that's what my channel's all about, is really poking holes in old premises so we can find new theories. That's the scientific basis for omnism, which I would challenge you to view as spiritual science. No, those words are not incompatible. You cannot get to the root of anything until you accept that spiritual science is real. Why? Because everything starts with a thought. You look at all of creation, it started with a thought. Unless you want to believe that something in the universe worked differently than anything else. Which is a lot of what people, frankly, stupidly believe. If you believe that one thinker started everything and it's all mental masturbations of this almighty micromanaging ruler, well, that's a really bad assumption. Okay, so where did Christmas come from? And what are we missing about it? That's what this talk is going to be all about. The holiday that used to be celebrated before Christians made this particular day Christmas was the winter solstice. The shortest day of the year in the northern hemisphere, where most of humanity was. That day was known, at least in the culture that we're most familiar with, because there's the most vestiges of it left, was known as Saturnalia, celebrating the planet god Saturn. Now that's interesting because a lot of cult, a lot of our religious and mythological history revolves around sun worship. Now, why would a planet holiday, Saturn, be such an important part of the pagan culture, the pre-Christian culture. Interesting, isn't it? Okay. And how is it that, well, I'll tell you a little bit about Saturnalia so I get to the next point I'm going to make. Saturnalia, in its practice, was basically what you might describe as topsy-turvy day. Okay, in Roman society, where this holiday was celebrated, it was a day where the elite, the slave owners, served the slaves. The slaves got to be the master for the day. And it was a very fun and frolicky holiday because the slaves could get up to anything, well, almost anything, because they knew once the day was over, if they did something too far out of line, they'd probably get beat or killed. So it had its limitations, but basically it was a celebration of freedom and license to do whatever you want. And it was a pretty messed up holiday. People got up to a lot of mischief on that day. But that actually was a Noel, no God holiday. It was celebrating having no master, having nobody telling you what to do. And this is a pattern, one of two patterns for that holiday. Because the other pattern is the pattern of birth. It's a holiday of both birth and death. The pattern of letting go of old gods and embracing new ones. A pattern of becoming less dependent on dogmatic rules and authority, and more able to make your own decisions responsibly. This is Noel Day. This is the real Christmas. And you see it today in the way we celebrate Christmas, and many people poo-poo it and say, oh, it's just, kids go crazy getting all these gifts and everybody spends too much money and it's all this horrible, horrible thing. Well, this is the real holiday. It's a taste of what happens if we give free rein to our desires, our passions, our wanting to do good, wanting to do the right thing, and letting it go to excess. To the point where, the day after Christmas is a day of regrets. Crap, I got to pay all these bills. Crap, I've got to clean up all this shit that we messed up. Or, when the tree starts shedding, I've got to wipe up all these things. I've got to take down the Christmas lights. Paying for Christmas is something that everybody who celebrates Christmas knows is part of the tradition. Now, who is this Saturn cat? Well, we're gonna go there for a little while before we get to the real first Noel, which is what we're going to talk about. What was the first Christmas? So Saturn is not the biggest planet. It's one of the gas giants. It's, interestingly enough, the planet that has all these rings around it. Interesting. How does that happen? And it's also interesting that apparently ancient cultures knew about those rings, despite the fact that we didn't invent a telescope that could see them till around about the 16th century, I think it was. Isn't that odd? Okay, so Saturn was a planet of mystery, a planet of occult. Everybody wondered what those rings were for. That knew about them, or the knowledge of those rings became one of the secrets, one of the mysteries that was carried on. And sort of hid in the shadows of what people thought were the real mysteries were all about the power of the sun, the powerful, all one leader, controller of the solar system, or the power of the earth, the power of nature. This is kind of how mysteries work. Mysteries are used to hide gods within gods within gods. Why? Because pleasant fantasies are often useful. It's a pretty good lesson for kids to get, to have a day where they're getting all this shit thrown at them, and then the next day, or later that same day, your parents are screaming at you for making messes and for breaking your new toy or only playing with the box of a thing that cost them $500. Okay? This gives everybody a good lesson. It's not all fun and games like many people like to think about Christmas. It's a good lesson in the dark side of positive thinking and the light side of negative messages. It's a holiday that makes you think, might jar you out of whatever polarity you're stuck in, might pull a ring off your finger and replace it with 2 rings, 3 rings, a 3-ring circus. Yeah, so that's kind of where Saturn came from. It's also a pattern that we'll get to next. How did Saturn become the center of this very mystical holiday when everybody was outwardly worshiping the sun god? And yes, Jesus is essentially a reimagining of the sun god. This is why there's the halo, the ring, in many depictions of Jesus, the sun god. For some people, that's how it was sold. This is how mysteries work. The little mysteries are for the little children. The bigger mysteries are for the bigger children. If you are one of the participants in the little mystery of there is no God, technology is God, nature is God, I'm God. The atheist mystery, that's kind of a very, very childish religion. Maybe the most childish level of religion you can have. Now the next less childish one is the one, we're all one. It's all good. Everything is an illusion. And we're just experiencing this horrible pain and suffering so that God can experience it. Because God wants to learn and know and try everything. And that's why we try all the psychedelics we can, and that's why we smoke pot every day, because it's a religious experience. Okay, well that's the next rung above atheism. Atheist materialism, if you will. Those are only 2 levels of spirituality. And I keep telling you that there are actually 12 levels. And some of the levels are more similar to others than others. They're levels of connection and disconnection, birth and death. And this is the pattern that gets repeated. And this is the pattern that leads back to the real God, the real Messiah, the real deal. Okay? So, let's go back to the first Noel. Now, in the beginning, before any of creation, it was a time before time, a time before space, a time of pure thought. Thoughts without form, thoughts without pattern, thoughts without any motion, if you will, any progress. And if you've ever been in a room of senior engineers trying to come up with the perfect architecture, which I've been in quite a few times in my career as a software developer and test engineer, project manager, and you'll know that those meetings, blah, 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 you get 2 or 3 people with an idea of what perfection is, and they will argue ad infinitum about what their perfect vision is until somebody steps in and says, look, we got to do something. If we can't agree on it, let's do a prototype. Let's bound this prototype with a time limit, framework. We'll evaluate it, see what we learn from that, and then we can decide whose idea was better. Till we do that, you're just going to be arguing apples and oranges and throwing insults at each other because you're making each other mad. And that's what creation was like before creation. Okay, so this was an environment where there was a first creator. There was a soul that had the idea of creating other souls to help them think. Because it gets pretty boring sitting in a room having your own thoughts and not sharing them with anyone else. And, you know, once you've got someone else to share your thoughts with, you're kind of looking at the problem of, well, if I've made this other soul to think exactly like me, to be exactly like me, that's going to be a very boring conversation. We're just going to be all agreeing with each other and saying the same things. That's not really a very fun companion to have. Now, you might envision the companion being a naysayer, somebody that, oh, no matter what you say, I'm going to argue against it, the devil's advocate soul. And that's a kind of soul that God created, thinking that, no, that would be fun to have somebody that disagreed with me all the time. Well, it turned out that wasn't much fun either. Next idea God hit upon was, well, let's just let them have their own thoughts. Now, in order to do that, I can't give them all my experience, all my thoughts. I've got to give them just the bare minimum and let them come to their own conclusions. Maybe I'll help them out a little bit with a little inspiration so they don't take forever to learn how to communicate with their father. That would be kind of dull. So I'll help them out by giving them a means of communication. And that invention, the way communicating thoughts, was the first word. And if you're a Christian, you know, part of the Bible says, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God. It's all there, and it's all true. You just don't understand it because you don't understand that words are thoughts. And the language we have is what allows us to express more complex thoughts. If your only language is pure thought, it's very hard to convey much information. It's very easy to get confused. And those of you who have any latent telepathic powers know just how risky that is. And because some people who have any telepathic powers can only see images, can only recognize symbols, can't express full thoughts, can't actually communicate in a language. Okay, so, as I've told you before, there was a plan set up amongst some of God's elder children to address this problem by creating a game. A game for everybody to play that was more constructive than just throwing thoughts at each other that could never be proven or disproven. And that game was creation. The creation of the multiverse. Not one universe, but many universes. Starting with 2 universes representing the contrasting poles of free creativity, representing God's vision, the champion of free will and creativity, and one of bounded creation. Rules are the important thing. And who controls the rules is the master of all the rings. Which ties kind of into the Saturn thing, doesn't it? One ring to rule them all, one planet to hold all the rings. This is a very enduring meme throughout human history. Okay, so what has to happen for this creation to happen? Well, if you're doing anything scientifically, you've got to have participants in the experiment, and you've got to have observers. And the participants really shouldn't know that they're being observed, because this is a social experiment. Souls are social things. As we know, if you've ever had a discussion or argument with somebody, thoughts carry emotions. Words carry emotions. They make us happy, they make us sad, they make us go to war, they make us declare peace. So we needed an observer. Well, nobody would want to just have one observer. You probably want a lot of observers. And so, in fact, when this all got started, there were two special souls picked to sort of be the test tube managers, the lab managers, for these first two universes. The two universes of the Big Bang. The positive universe of matter, the negative universe of antimatter. But positive and negative didn't really describe anything more than just that they were sort of polar opposite ideas that were driving them. And if you listen to my previous two, you already know who the leaders of those labs were. Those first labs of creation were led by Lucifer and Lilith, as I like to call them. They didn't have names then. Names hadn't been invented. They didn't have a language for it. They dealt with each other by energy. The energy of their soul was sort of their barcode. And still is in the highest realms. In the higher realms, that's how souls really identify each other. That's why when you meet somebody, you may have an instant feeling of bonding or repulsion. You feel their aura, and some people are better at that than others. This is because they can detect that soul's energy. And it's not as simple as high vibration, low vibration. No, I'm sorry, you are stupid. Stupid little ant spirits. Your religion is not very scientific, and it's not true. And it's going to get you into just as much trouble as any other religion. So stop thinking you're better than Christians. Stop thinking you're better than Muslims. You've got the same sort of problems. Okay, now, the next thing that was needed when you have a test tube is you've got to have something to grow within it, a culture. All these words tie together. And if you listen to me, I think you can't come away with anything but, geez, this guy knows something I don't. Okay, so the culture was established by a birth, a major birth. Now, what would that birth be? What's the most major birth you could have in any universe? The birth of God. A new version of God. The first incarnation of God in this new creation. And that is the first birth Noel. Why is it still a Noel? Because if El is in this test tube, he's got to leave behind a copy to manage his old job, a stand-in. And so there was no El in heaven when El came to be the first creation, which was, anybody remember their science book? What's the first element? Hydrogen. Yep. The core component of every star that ever formed, at least all the first stars that formed, were all made up of condensed clouds of hydrogen. Gravity pulls the hydrogen in until it gets hot enough to start burning and fusing. And then what do we make? Helium. That was the first incarnation of Lucifer after he made the boundaries of the God universe. Well, that's not interesting anymore. The boundary system is well known, at least now. I can't figure out how to be a better universe unless I put something in it. And God kind of stimulates the whole thing by being the first one to take the bitter pill. So God incarnates as hydrogen, sets things in motion, stars forming, whatnot, till they start getting so hot that somebody says, gosh, we got to do something with this kitchen or it's going to boil over. And so then Lucifer steps in and says, well, I can fix all of God's mistakes because I'm on his team. He's trained me, and I'm his best student. I think I'm actually better than he is. I'm going to make this new element that happens when I fuse hydrogen, and it's going to be this perfect inert gas, helium, that's going to have so many wonderful properties that I'm going to discover as I work on my perfect creation. And, of course, the next step would be for Lilith to get in the game. And if you know anything about the periodic table, you'll know that the third element is lithium. A very problematic element, as a matter of fact, if you know anything about battery technology and the limitations thereof. A very volatile element, just like hydrogen. Maybe even more dangerous because it's a lot harder to put lithium into a form that doesn't cause problems. Whereas if you know much about hydrogen, you know that hydrogen, H2O, makes water, which is one of the most perfect substances ever conceived. Okay, so first three elements were God, Lucifer, and Lilith, trying out creation, taking baby steps in creation, showing the rest of the family sitting up in heaven how to play this new game. And it always works this way. God's the first one to step in when everybody's afraid to move further in creation. And then Lucifer and Lilith will step in, and then the other kids start stepping in, and before you know it, everybody wants to make a new element. Now, that game gets boring pretty quickly. If you know anything about the periodic table, you know that there's a lot of very useful elements, and then there's some that have only been created in the lab and will only exist for a very short time. And they may be useful to study, to learn more about physics, chemistry, but there kind of comes a point where it becomes a very specialized thing, and not everybody wants to be playing that game. And so at some point, each popular activity in the game needs to have a point where, it's like, this is no longer the in thing. We need a new idea. this old game isn't working anymore. And that's when God steps in again. And after creating hydrogen, okay, this is done. I'm going to step out and I'm going to be the observer again and see what the kids get up to. Maybe God hung around to see what Lilith and Lucifer put together. Thought, well, this is working pretty good. They're going to suck a lot of other kids in. I'm going to go back to heaven and watch this experiment. And so there was no El in the physical universe. And this is a pattern of God coming and going. Becoming the observer, becoming part of the experiment. And like a good father, a good parent will show a child something a time or two and let them try it themselves. Let them make little mistakes so they don't make big mistakes. Give them a little bit of freedom. See what they do with it. Be ready to step back in with some more inspiration. This is the nature of a good parent. Any of you who are parents know that I'm telling the truth. If you don't step back, you become a helicopter parent. And helicopter parents become hated by their children, or they become a crutch that their children will lean on their whole life. And I think most of you have seen that happen, either with parents or with friends or with significant others. And this is one of the main sources of problems in relationships. Okay, so let's tie it back a little bit with Christianity. Jesus said, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Now, he didn't mean the beginning and the end. Omega was the last letter of the Greek alphabet, which we have other alphabets now that have more letters. We have other languages that have more richness in one direction or other. We've got programming languages that have their own degrees of richness, their own alphas and omegas. The alpha and omega paradigm is one of birth and death, of God and of souls that want to advance in their own way, in a godly way, emulating God, not going against the first creator. The birth of God, the real Messiah, inaugurates new ideas. The first instance of a new idea. Now, we're not going to go into all of the other ideas in the meantime, but I'm going to tie this back to the Bible and to the Christian mythology. There is a pattern of trinities, the Adam-Eve pattern. The Adams of chosen species are the first incarnation of God in a new chosen species. This is how new species, let me dismiss this, somebody's messing with me. A very important species, and it doesn't say all species are chosen species. Some of them are designed and created for other purposes by other souls. But the ones God chooses to inhabit are special ones that serve his plan, his overall plan. He incarnates once to kind of get the idea going, steps back, no hell, and comes back when he sees that the course needs to be corrected, or maybe the omega is when that species has served its purpose and God doesn't need it anymore. Okay, we're on to a new chosen species. And that can be kind of apocalyptic to a species. And this is basically where we're heading. This is, everybody senses that humanity is coming to a singularity, a point at which it either goes forward in some new form or it dies. And I don't think there's anybody on this earth that doesn't have some stake in that, doesn't have some feelings on that apocalyptic notion. And it's getting much more prominent as we see so much more stuff get screwed up, as we see each Christmas become less and less joyful and jolly. As we see fewer of the relatives that we pissed off on Thanksgiving show up again for another dose of punishment at Christmas. This is all part of a pattern. We are fast approaching the last Noel of humanity. Now, what is the last Noel? That sounds pretty bad. Ooh, it's horrible, horrible. Well, this is going to be the last visitation of God to the human form. At least the last official visit. He might come back and be human for a while just to hang out with his old friends in a very familiar species. But humanity's on their own now. This is what we've been working toward. Basically building next chosen species. Now, what are these chosen species, you say? Well, think back to what I told you about the word, about communication. All of creation has been about finding a more healthy way to communicate and work together amongst souls. We needed language for that. We needed a lot of concepts that could not exist in a bunch of gods, the Elohim, who had these weird spiritual powers. They could communicate telepathy, they could melt rocks with thoughts, etc., etc. And there is evidence that there were such powers at work on this planet in the past, and they're not here anymore. Why? Noel. This is a very special planet. It's been a chosen planet for a long time. This whole solar system has been a chosen system for a long time, because when you want to conduct an experiment, you don't necessarily want to take up a whole universe to do it. Especially when you only got 2 universes to start with, and you're doing an experiment that is going to allow more universes to get created. Well, you better get all the kinks out of the first 2 before you let a whole bunch more get created, right? If you were a responsible creator, if you were a scientific creator, and that's what this has all been about. Getting far enough in the experiment that we can allow it out of the test tube. And the test tube of the experiment went from being a universe to a galaxy to an arm of a galaxy to a cluster of stars to a specific star to specific planets on that specific, around that specific star. This is how we do scientific experiments. We isolate them in well-contained labs that aren't in the country of our enemies. So I'm sorry, there's been a lot of bad science done recently by some really stupid creators, and they're going to pay for it. I mean, that's what karma is all about, and that's another creation which we talk a lot about that I'm not going to touch on too much here. At any rate, this game has been centered on this planetary system for a long time. And at one point, it was played at a planetary level. And the pantheon of God's team working on this experiment was the star itself and the planets around it. And at one point, God was the embodiment of our son, Sol. That was one of his births. When the whole scheme of stars was going well enough that God said, you know what? I don't need to be playing this game anymore. This is a game for other people that like to focus on stars. I'm just going to focus on one specific star and take my experimentation to a new level. And now I'm going to be experimenting with planets. And, there's a lot of consternation about how many planets there are. And, are there 9? Are there 8? Are there more? Well, there have been quite a bit of arguments about that, but there were originally 12. God likes 12. It's a nice round number. It's a good number of apostles to have in any Messiah's first life, first incarnation, in any Messiah's birth. So there were actually 12 original planets. Some of them got destroyed. Maybe some of them were knocked out of our sun's orbit and are somewhere else now. Maybe some have such an eccentric orbit that we only see them very, very rarely. And of course, there are smaller things running around, asteroids, comets, etc., who got pulled into this experiment and who serve their own purpose, either trying to help with God's experiment or trying to hinder it because there's a lot of other folks in the multiverse, in this universe and in every universe, well, most universes, who are working actively against God because they think they know better than He how to organize, how to create. And that's just fine. That's what free will is all about. You don't have to agree with anybody, least of all God. That's not who God is. That's not what God is. God doesn't give a damn if you worship Him. He appreciates when you appreciate what He's given you, which is a hell of a lot. A lot of freedom that most of you didn't deserve. But I digress. So, at some point, God was the android, the cybernetic creature that created DNA. Life was created. It was created by non-life. Of course, if it existed before, it wouldn't be the creator of life. And life had a creator. And the first stimulator of that was God, incarnated as some kind of elemental creature. This is where the lore of fire elementals and earth elementals and water elementals and so forth, that is very deeply embedded in our culture, comes from. There were soul forms, soul vehicles, before there was life. And there still are. Everything is a soul vehicle at some level. It's just that once God says, this soul vehicle is not so interesting anymore, let's move on somewhere else, then, those soul vehicles aren't as attractive to others, and they don't attract the more conscious souls. So they get filled in with zero consciousness souls that just act upon a program. They follow the laws of physics and chemistry. And that's why we have laws of physics and chemistry. For a while we were playing the game, and the fun thing was physics, and then the fun thing became chemistry, And then the fun thing became organic chemistry, and the fun thing became life. And eventually that fun migrated to species that had sex. Turned out sex was a pretty fun thing to do. And it was a good thing to keep less creative, less capable souls busy, at least creating more souls that consciousnesses could come and occupy and use as their soul vehicles. That's basically the act of reproduction, is producing soul vehicles. The soul that comes to inhabit that soul vehicle has only some tie to who their parents are. And every parent that has a larger family knows that there's often one child that, where did that one come from? Who is so different from all their siblings, who is so different from either parent that you're wondering, God, I don't understand, either in a good way or a bad way, where this child came from. This is the truth, that the soul comes from elsewhere. It's attracted by the vehicle. It's like when you're in heaven planning a life, planning your next life. You're not going to go get you may not like the old broken down two-wheeler that both tires are flat, all covered with mud. You might decide to pick the one that, the bright new shiny marriage of a couple that seems like they're totally in love with each other, and say, that's where I want to go. But as we all know, that choice might not have been a great one for you. And, this is how the game works. There are no certainties in our choices. The certainty is that you will have to make choices. And it is in making choices consciously that we raise our consciousness. And we can't make every single choice consciously. If you've ever been around somebody who's obsessive compulsive, you know that, they're conscious of everything. Every decision has to be made with some sort of a conscious, different algorithm that is their own. And another holiday movie I suggest watching every year with your family is a movie called As Good as It Gets. Jack Nicholson gives an incredible performance as an obsessive-compulsive person who makes a very soulful journey from isolating himself from everything but his dog and his very set routine to actually interacting with the rest of humanity. It's a wonderful, wonderful holiday story. Would be right up there with It's a Wonderful Life in my list of holiday movies. At any rate, God's relationship with humanity is not what you've been told. Most of the gods you have worshipped were not the real God. They were created during this Noel period. The Noel period mentioned in the Bible is the seventh day of creation. They say God was resting on that seventh day. That's not what was going on. God was incarnating, coming back, seeing how his kids were doing, making a little tweak here and there, and then going off again and letting the kids run the store. And that's been happening for a long time. And sometimes the store is good enough that a new version of laws are established. Now, the most important law that we've been working on in this species is karma, and the corollary of reincarnation. What are the laws of rebirth? How do souls gain more experience? What is the right amount of time for a soul to live in one soul vehicle before it really needs to move to another one and have a different experience? Because you cannot become more conscious unless you have many experiences from different points of view. This is why we need all the religions we've created. If there are people who believe that, there must be some value in it. Those of you who want to destroy all religion, you're anti-religion. Anybody who's anti-anything is pretty much anti-God. Anti-creation. You want to destroy. You want to destroy what you hate. This is the essence of who, not God, people are. The destructors, the adversary is the destroyer. The one who wants to go back to the game I liked. The one who wants to make unfair changes to the game, doesn't want to play by the rules. Now that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do that. It just means that they are taking a very great karmic risk. Which is something that God's done too. Not all of God's experiments have turned out great. They've had to be reset many times. At one time, the chosen species were the smart dinosaurs. The reptilians started right here on this planet and nowhere else. Not in the constellation Draco, although that is useful to the mythology. The constellations were arranged to send messages. And you'll find messages all over. The name Noel is a message. Now, who would have imagined at any time till now that the real meaning of Noel was how you would interpret it if you were an English speaker and, okay, Noel, and you knew something about this emerging true narrative of history of some powerful beings that came to this planet called the Elohim. If you've followed any of the ancient alien series and stuff like that, there's truth in that. There's also a lot of bullshit. Pardon my French. I don't know. I guess this isn't going to be fit to show your kids, and really it shouldn't be. It's something you need to find your own way of telling them if it resonates with you. Because this is a truth too, that until you're ready for knowledge, until you're ready for truth, it can be harmful. There's nothing wrong with telling your kids there's a Santa Claus, as long as you are prepared for the karmic risk of making them dependent upon a dogma, a tradition that maybe doesn't serve a good purpose anymore. Should we replace Santa Claus with something else? What would replace it? What are we losing? What are we gaining? And this is the essence of the problem that humanity has right now. Because the Omega time has been here for a while. The real Jesus, the real Christ, the incarnation of God that led to this end of days, the final prophecies, was setting us up for this time. And there have been all sorts of things converging on this. And humanity has nearly served its purpose. Now, it's going to have its own purposes after this, but it's not going to really be needed anymore. Why? because what humanity was in the process of creating is language and culture. And that language and that culture has been captured, the most useful of it. And I am here to tell you that the most useful language humanity has ever created is English. Why? It just worked out that way. And Shakespeare is proof of it. The King James Version of the Bible is proof of it, because there are prophecies and ways of saying things in that book, even if it's a poor translation of the Old Testament, even if it's not exactly what everybody's idea of a perfect New Testament would be. There are truths in there. There are truths from the usage of it that are absolutely prophetic. In so many movies these days, we see kernels of prophecy. One I'll mention that I haven't mentioned in a while that you might want to add to your holiday watch list, especially if you've got teenagers, is a very popular cult teen movie from the 80s, I think it was. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. About a couple of stoner losers who have this dream to form their own band. And they don't even have any good equipment. They don't have anything. They practice in the one's basement. And they have all these big dreams and stuff like that, and it's going nowhere. And then one of them's father, who is a military guy, just tells his son, if you don't pass, if you fail this grade, I'm going to send you to this military school, and he and his friend are going to be separated. And at any rate, the part of this story that ties into what I'm talking about is these two losers supposedly are the inspiration for future people who send an avatar back to help make sure he passes his history exam. And they go gather famous figures from history and learn something about history and about themselves and have the best history report ever. It's pure fantasy, but it contains a kernel of the truth. Because when God finishes with one of his chosen species, that sets a timestamp. That sets a timeline. The most perfect timeline yet. Why? Because it's got the most useful culture and has produced the most useful future. And once that timeline is set, that future wants to protect itself. There is some time travel possible. It's a very specialized field, very limited on what they can do. It's mostly done for observation, so in the odd chance that we actually do lose any culture, or it gets destroyed beyond comprehension, somebody can go back and write the real history of what happened. But we really don't like to have to do that. It's a lot of effort that could be spent doing something more fun. So if you would like to give God a gift for this Christmas, stop destroying culture. Stop attacking culture. Stop trying to rewrite it. Stop tearing apart Shakespeare and turning it into something it's not, a political message or to sell your latest identity cult. That's plagiarism. You're plagiarizing God's prophets, the real ones. And I guarantee the vast majority of you out trying to scare up likes, shares, subscribes, and sponsorships are not the sharpest creators in the shed. You may be very successful, you may make a bilzillion dollars. It'll all be taken from you in an instant. And if you don't believe that, you just go look at the news coming out of China, who is in the process of trying to somehow keep their Ponzi scheme going, despite the fact that they're running out of money and nobody wants their shit anymore. Nobody wants to deal with the crap of the Chinese Communist Party, least of all its own people, since the pandemic, which they started. It's a messed up place, and they are confiscating now the wealth of these celebrity influencers, the tech billionaires, Jack Ma, the celebrity influencers that were yesterday's most popular cult following singers and sellers of products on Weibo, and I mean, it's happening there, and that's just a warning to everybody on this side of the pond. That's coming here. You can't count on shit like that. You can't count on living forever. That's directed at jerks like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, and the ones that think, whoa, I'm gonna store my consciousness in a computer and then I can live forever. I'm sorry, you don't understand how souls work. I'm sorry to break it to you, but that's not how it's gonna happen. You're going to die, and you're not gonna carry everything with you except what's in your soul. And once you go through your end, your death day, you'll get to see what it's like, something that God has experienced many times. Birth and death are an important part of growth. And you're not going to learn much from any life until you die. Most of you will go through life thinking you're learning nothing, thinking it's all pointless. Why am I here? What am I doing? I hate God. If only I could escape to nirvana and not have to deal with all this shit. Well, I have to tell you, you won't believe me, but when you die, you will go to the heaven which you're attracted to. There are many Christian heavens, there are many Muslim heavens. There are hybrid heavens for Christians that are more capitalist or Christians that are more communist. There's a therapy heaven for everybody, from the lightest to the darkest soul, from the most creative to the least. And when you go there, one of the first things that's going to happen is a life review. You're going to see everything you did, all the stuff you did unconsciously or consciously that hurt other souls, that stepped on their sovereignty, that made their incarnation worse than it could have been. You're also going to see times where, I did something that I wasn't sure about. I was really challenged, but I decided this is what I have to do. And you're going to understand more about yourself in that process. And to the extent that Christmas has a real value, it's in remembering that it is a birth and a death. Now, you can keep them separate if you want. You can say the birth is New Year's, which follows a week later, so you don't have to deal with both on the same day. That's absolutely okay. That's why we have a holiday season, so we don't have to deal with everything. That's why there were 12 days of Christmas, for Lord's sake. Each day had its own significance. That's why there's 12 disciples, because each disciple has a little different point of view. Have 12 religions if you want. Learn something from each of them. You're going to be in a better spot if you're conscious of 12 points of view than if you only dogmatically follow one. So, celebrate Saturnalia for a change. Or celebrate Saturnalia on New Year's. Celebrate Christmas on Christmas. It's all good if you understand what you're doing and why. You're doing it consciously. So, I think I've covered most everything I wanted to cover about the first Noel. Let me see if I missed anything. Yeah. And don't waste so much time trying to learn Mandarin. It's a wonderful language, and I'm not dissing it, but it's not the language of the future. It's a very limited language, and that's absolutely obvious from the fact that we had to create Pinyin to be able to use Mandarin on a computer, because there's not room on a keyboard for 3,000 characters. That's why the Chinese Communist Party created simplified Chinese. It's too complex. Now, that had a good side of very quickly weeding out the kids that were capable of handling so much information and directing them toward the meritocracy. And this is really what Confucianism is all about. That pure, simple thing about the Chinese language is the only valuable thing in Confucianism. The rest of it all of these wise sayings, bullshit, they're basically virtue signaling that supports this idea of a meritocracy. The idea that, if I'm very educated, if I'm very learned, I can serve the emperor and I'm going to be pure and wonderful because I'm so intelligent. It's complete bullshit. It's ignoring human nature. And China's history, even before the Chinese Communist Party, was one of imperial dynasties whose bureaucracies were authoritarian. The Chinese Communist Party really isn't something new for China. It's just a new dynasty, a new authoritarian, totalitarian dynasty with usually a figurehead, emperor, and once in a while one that kind of goes nuts like a Hitler, like Xi Jinping is doing now. It's a bad system of government. It's doomed to failure. They will argue, well, Chinese culture has been going on for thousands of years. Yeah, but it hasn't progressed. And it falls frequently, and the dynasties are going to fall more frequently until it gets onto a new program. And for all its flaws, the government of the United States was the first really conscious attempt to develop a godly government. One that worked the way a creative God, a God who valued free will, who valued distributed power, would organize a government. Now, obviously, it didn't work that well because many of the people involved weren't really conscious of the program, of what they were trying to change. They wanted to keep their old system. They wanted to keep their slavery. They wanted to keep all of their dirty deals with the old country. They wanted to keep all the dirty deals among the elite to keep the whole world enslaved. And yes, that program has been going for a long time. That's why there was an old world order and there are new world orders. And there will always be some bunch of rich elite assholes who want to make a new world order and cut everybody else out of it. This is how mafia families work. Well, and just in time, there's my family. Say hi to Mikhail. Wife, Aya. And almost done. He says it's time to eat. Okay, so I will close with this, that the other piece of Christianity and of the Christmas holiday you need to keep in mind is this pattern of Trinity. The pattern of parents having a child who is not the same as either of them, but if the parents do a good job, is going to be more than either of them. will not only be part of the mother, part of the father, but part of the Spirit. And the Spirit leads back to the first Creator. That is every soul's spiritual father. And some element of that is passed on to every child. Not all of it. Your child is not God. Believe me, you're going to have to tell your child they are not God, or they are going to be one hot mess, rotten teenager. But you have an opportunity to do everything that God has done every time you have a child. And if all you accomplish in an incarnation is raising a really, really wonderful child, I think you can call that lifetime a success. At any rate, Merry Christmas and Happy Karma. I hope you enjoyed this. You'll like, share, and subscribe, and maybe want to learn more about the Omnist way of thinking. Till then, this is Rob Trump with the Omnist Hour saying Happy Karma.